you're lucky it wasn't Wolverhampton Wanderers goalkeepers. So it's nice to be back in Cornwall. My wife is Cornish. I got married in Truro in 1976. And actually my brother-in-law did all of these displays and so on. He has a sign writing business in St. Austell. So it's good. I feel like I'm at home. So I want to talk about oxygen. And when anybody talks about oxygen or thinks about oxygen, they straight away think about freshness and staling and so on. And that's primarily why I'm going to talk about today. But oxygen is very, very important to brewers in so many ways. If you don't have enough oxygen to give to the yeast, then yeast will not behave. And we've reached the year 2018, and I don't think anybody has ever satisfactorily explained why some yeasts need more oxygen than others. So there's, it's just one example of the many research topics that are still available to people if they want to study them, and if there's enough money and interest in addressing them. And of course, in fermentation itself, oxygen is very, very important, and it has a profound influence on the flavor of beer. And as I tell my students, you want to cut down the level of esters in your beer, then give the yeast a lot more oxygen because it'll make more yeast material and cut down the amount of esters. So it has a major influence on the flavor of a beer. And it also influences the clarity of beer. So that straight away takes us into an interesting topic area. I'm not sure whether it's the alt-right or the radical left that has driven us into the area of extremely cloudy beer. Chicken soup, as I call it. In all my years, I've always been taught that beer should be bright. With some obvious exceptions, Hefeweizen for one, Cooper Sparkling Ale for another. Probably some of you have heard this story before. The very first time I ever went to Australia, I was in a bar and I asked for a Cooper Sparkling Ale. By the way, Tim Cooper is a very good friend of mine. So I got this Cooper Sparkling Ale, took it back to my seat, poured it out. It was cloudy, so I took it back to the bar and I said, I think there's something wrong with the beer. And the guy said, it's supposed to look like that, you pommy bastard. Just drink it. So I learned a lesson right there. And lest I forget it, by the way, before we talk about flavor stability, if you go to Adelaide and buy a Cooper's Sparkling Ale or indeed other beers, there's a best after date on the beer these days. So they don't have a best before date, they have a best after date. So there's more than one way to skin a cat. But back to this business of cloudy beer, and there's this obsession these days, and I think it really is the so-called craft brewing industry in the US and other places that are really saying, oh well, these guys who filter the beer, they're purifying it, they're stripping away all the goodness, and real good beer is stuff that looks like chicken soup. And all I can say is I look at it and straight away I start thinking about my bowels. I don't want you to think about my bowels, but that's what I think about. If I'm going to consume a pint of this, what the hell is it going to do to me? But I'm getting away from oxygen. But oxygen has a profound influence to play on the clarity of beer. So let's talk about freshness and flavor stability. And it's in the context of oxygen. Of course, oxygen is one of the big factors that are influencing it. And it's a tough area. Because just how important is it? Just how important is the freshness of beer? Do people care? Years ago, when I was a research director at BRF International with the charming Georgina in the team, I went to the corridors of power in London. In those days, the British government would give money to people to do research on beer. Those were far-sighted days. And I went into the corridors of power, and there's a guy in a pinstripe suit. And he said, good morning. And I said, good morning. He said, how are you all? Because that's how they talk in the corridor of power. And I said, I'm very well, thank you. And the guy said, what can I do for you? I said, well, we like to work on the freshness of beer. And he said, I see. What's the problem? I said, well, beer goes stale. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it develops the flavor of wet paper and tomcat pea. Now, if I was a winemaker, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said damp, parchment, and feline. But the guy said, I see. So why does this happen? I said, well, beer gets oxidized. I see. And do you have a best before date on beer? I said, yes, we do. And he said, what is it? I said, 9 months, typically. He said, and will the beer go stale in that time? I said, yes. He said, well, why do you set it at 9 months? I said, because we're pretty confident it's not going to go cloudy. Because I was always raised to believe that beer should be bright. It's not going to go cloudy in 9 months. I see. So it can be on the shelf for up to 9 months. I said, yes. And it can be stale in that time. I said, yes. He said, do people buy it? I said, yes. He said, what's the problem? What's the problem? And I said, and I think the problem is that, you know, I believe personally that a quality beer is a beer that meets your expectation. And it should taste the way you predict it to taste. And if it tastes one way one day and another way another day, it's inconsistency. And that's not a good thing. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whatever time, you should have a product and you say, I'm going to buy that beer because it will taste like this. Now, I know in 2018, and many people say, oh, that's old-fashioned idea, you've got to have variation, and this is a good one. Oh, it's a good one this year, and so on. Well, I personally don't believe that. And in most products that you're going to buy, you know, you go buy some fish fingers, and they come out tasting of curry, you got a shock, haven't you? So why should it be any different for beer? Anyway, they gave us the money. But, you know, it does beg the point. A lot of people buy stale beer. Every second year I bring a class to the UK, and in 2016 we went to a brewery which will not be named, and there was beer in the warehouse there. I noticed it. It was 5 months old. It hadn't even left the brewery, and it was 5 months old. So people worry about staleness and freshness. For goodness sake. You know, live the life, be realistic. And if you're not going to really believe in it, and if you're only going to pay lip service to it, then you're just not going to, it's irrelevant to talk about oxygen in beer. So if you want to worry about it, then yeah, I'll talk to you about oxygen in beer. Here's another story, and it's not to do with staleness, but it is to do with how a beer tastes. And Mark Dobner's in the room. He was one of the team at Bass Preston Brook, or Bass Piston Brook, as we used to lovingly call it. And we used to make Carling Black Label, along with several other breweries in the group. And of course, every month we had to send our beer to the mothership, Burton-on-Trent, and it was tasted. So all the Carling and the tenants as well, because the tenants were supposed to match the Carling. Don't you come up here, turns out a blue lager. You wee Sassenach bastard. Anyway, happy days. So the beer used to be sent into Preston Brook, to Burton-on-Trent, and they'd taste it, and they'd say, okay, which one is Preston Brook? And everybody would say, it's this one. And why was that? It was grainy. It had a clear, grainy character. So the head brewer, Neil Talbot, and myself, we cleaned it up. And headquarters were delighted. And that's when people started complaining. What have you done to the beer? You screwed up the beer. What have you done to the beer? Because people were used to this character. The customers were used to it. Headquarters didn't like it. So if you put out a product that has a off flavor, make sure you put out that off flavor every time, because people want it. There's a lot of beer in many parts of the world that is stale. Make sure it's uniformly stale. I remember going to a presentation once, and there's a guy from South African breweries. And he stood up and he said, I think we should make the beer as stale as possible before it leaves the brewery, on account of the fact it's never going to get any worse than that. Now, I think he had his tongue in his cheek, but I'm not absolutely sure that, you know. I'll give you another story. And soon after I arrived in Davis, I took a well-known brand of beer, which will remain nameless, had an eagle floating across it, and we put it in the oven for a month at 40 degrees Celsius. And so it was nice and cardboardy, let me tell you. And then we took it and the non-aged version of that same beer with the eagle floating across it, and we took it into Sacramento and gave it to people to drink. So first of all, we put the fresh beer onto one mat, which had the name of the company on it, and the stale beer on the other mat, which had the same branding on it, and we asked people for their preference, and 50% preferred the fresh, and 50% preferred the stale. And we did the same thing. We put the fresh on a white mat, plain white mat, and the stale on a plain white mat, and 50% preferred the fresh, and 50% preferred the stale. Then we took the stale beer and we put it in both glasses, and we put one on a mat which had the name of the brand on it, and one on a white mat, and they voted 2-1 for the one on the white mat. And then we put the fresh beer into both glasses, put one on a branded mat and one on a white mat, and they voted 2-1 for the one on the branded mat. So they knew something was going on, but they were heavily distracted by the branding. So I haven't named the beer, but a representative from Anheuser-Busch phoned me up and said, "Charlie." I said, "Yeah, why did you do that? Why did you do that experiment?" I said, "Because I'm a fresh, young, curious scientist." The point is, people get confused. So there's a lot of stale beer that is drunk. But I think the problem arises in the real world when things drift, terribly much. So it's an arguable point. There's a lot of beer that's imported into the UK, into the US, that is terribly stale. My old company's Bass Ale, I'd far sooner have it now brewed in Baldwinsville, New York, and shipped across to Sacramento than if it was brewed in Burton-on-Trent and bounced around on an ocean through whoever knows what conditions and then crossed the country into Sacramento. It'll be fresher. It is fresher. It's cleaner. And as long as they know what they're doing, they're using the right malt, hops, yeast, water, process, and so on, you get a pretty good match, and it's fresher. So I personally believe that freshness is important. I personally believe that stale beer is less drinkable. This is, there's a famous experiment in Japan, and John was talking about the ingenuity of the Japanese, and they had a test for drinkability, and the test was how much people peed. So they had people drinking beer, and they were collecting and measuring their pee, okay? And they found that there was the cylinders containing the fresh beer, the urine from the fresh beer, was a lot more than with the stale beer. And probably it's because they drank a lot more of it, and therefore they peed more out. So that's why on an airplane, you should always drink stale beer. But anyway, that's another story. So let's assume that we want fresh beer. How do we achieve fresh beer? And there is this obsession that's going on with attending to oxidation earlier and earlier in the process. And what they're trying to do, in my opinion, is blame the maltster. And it's a long-standing adage, if anybody's to blame, it's the bloody maltster. So they're trying to bring this into flavor stability. Well, give me a break, it ain't gonna wash. And I'm gonna tell you why, okay? So it's a complicated process. And people are looking for fancier and fancier ideas about how to keep beer fresh and how to get freshness in beer. A number of years ago, I talked to the Master Brewers Association in Americas in Milwaukee, and they gave me a fancy title. It was a critical control point analysis of the flavor stability of beer. Everybody sat there, pens poised, and they were going to write all these notes down, and I stood up and I said, keep out the oxygen from the finished beer and keep it cold. Are there any questions? And this guy looked at me and he says, huh. And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, what do you say to everybody who's invested in a brew house with minimum oxygen uptake? I said, have you invested in refrigerated distribution? Have you invested in packaging lines which give you absolutely minuscule levels of oxygen? Because if you haven't, you are piddling in the wind. And there's nothing you can do in the brew house, and there's nothing you can blame the maltster for to actually rectify the situation. So flavor stability and freshness is all about working back. It's all about working back. Now, before I elaborate that point some more, let me talk about the sort of the changes that take place in beer with storage. And the important thing to say is that it's very complicated. Different beers can age in different ways. And when anybody talks about flavor stability, by the way, I don't use PowerPoint, so hopefully I'm painting a few pictures for you without it. But the thing that everybody comes back to is Charles Dalgleish. Now, one or two of you will remember Charles Dalgleish. Charles Dalgleish was the director of the Brewing Research Foundation when I arrived. So that was his claim to fame. But anyway, no, that's a joke. But Charles Dalgleish, of course, produced that famous illustration which shows that there was a decrease in bitterness of beer with time. And that's true. The bitterness level goes down. And then there was an increase and then a decrease in ryebees, which is the blackcurrant bud or tomcat urine aroma. And then there was an increase in sweet character, but there's increase in cardboard. And that was it. That's what people trot out every time. But there are countless other changes take place in beer with time. Countless other changes, and different beers age in different ways. And what I used to say was, oh, well, it's the bland beers, the gently flavored North American lagers, which are the toughest to achieve flavor stability on, because they don't disguise anything. Okay? And people, prominent names from the craft brewing industry, so-called craft brewing industry in Northern California, say, Charlie, we've got bigger problems with our hoppy beers. And the loss of hop character, for example, is a much bigger issue for us than the development of cardboard flavors. And people like Ken Grossman did a lot of work on scalping, which is hop aroma, hop oils sticking onto the inside of the crown corks, and the hop character going down with time. And there are many other changes. Increase in graininess, increase in muesli character, the ultimate insult, increase in wine-like character. These sorts of things, you know. Different beers will age in different ways. And the other thing is, the flavor changes taking place are in substances at tiny levels. If you want to achieve haze stability in a beer, and I believe it's easier to achieve haze stability than consistently achieve chicken soup, but if you want to achieve haze stability, you just got to get rid of bucket loads of materials, okay? You got to get rid of polyphenols. You got to get rid of haze-forming proteins. You got to get rid of beta-glucans. You got to get rid of pentasans. You got rid of oxalate. You do all of those things, and it doesn't influence the quality of the beer. But with flavor stability, you can't do those things. You can't say, you know, there's 2,000 different flavor substances that are changing, and you've only got to have a change in one of them, and that's flavor instability, either increasing or decreasing. So it is hopelessly complicated, hopelessly complicated. And you know, it's easy just to give up. So there are all these different changes that can take place. So there are three general things that a brewer can do, in my opinion, in the brewery to increase flavor stability. And the first of these is to get the oxygen level in the finished package as low as possible. Now, 20 years ago, people like me would stand up and say, oh, you know, 0.3 parts per million is pretty good. That's hopelessly too much. 0.1 is too much in this day and age. So simply put, the lower the oxygen level in the finished package, the better. And that should go hand in hand with minimum levels of iron, copper, and we've done a lot of work recently on this, manganese, because those are going to boost the action of the oxygen. So the oxygen level and those metal ions as low as physically possible. Now this is why beer is more stable in a can than it is in a bottle. Now when you package a can, you can't quite get to such a low oxygen level as you can in a bottle. But that's it. But in a bottle, oxygen can get through the neck, between the neck and the crown cork, and increase the oxygen level with time. So the tighter that seal, the better. That's why Sierra Nevada went back from the sort of classic American twist-off to the pry-off crown corks. And the inner lining is very, very important. And of course, you can buy oxygen scavenging crown corks. But a can, no oxygen is going to get into a can. Now, not long ago, well, a few years ago, I was in Oklahoma City, and I still don't know how I got there, but I got into Oklahoma City with my wife and daughter. And I'm in a restaurant. It's a nice restaurant. There was a white tablecloth. And this woman said, "What do you want to drink?" I said, "What craft brews do you have?" She said, "I got Bud Miller and Coors." I said, "Is that it?" She said, "No, I got one other." I said, "What is it?" She said, "Pabst Blue Ribbon." I said, "I'll have one of those." And along it came in a can. And I went, "Oh." And my wife said, "You hypocrite. You hypocrite. You stand up, you pontificate about how beer is better in a can than it is in a bottle. People bring you beer in a can and you moan about it." I said, "A can doesn't belong in a restaurant. It's presentation, it's psychological." At least they gave me a glass, which is a miracle in America. Absolute miracle. I was in San Francisco International Airport one time, and I went into the Gordon Biersch place, and the first thing they did was ask for the proof of my age. I said, "How badly do you think I've lived?" They said, "We card everybody." I said, "I'll have a Gordon Biersch Hefeweizen." They brought it to me in a Bud Light glass. They say, "What's the right glass for a beer?" It's the one that's not got the wrong name on it. But I digress. So it's psychological. People think, "Oh, cans, it'll give you a metallic taste." No, it doesn't. They're lacquered, for God's sake. Okay? So in terms of shelf life, no oxygen will get in. The second thing is keep the beer as cold as possible without freezing it. So some of you may be devotees of Budweiser and Bud Light. And on it, there is a born-on date, which is the date in which that beer was packaged. And it says next to it, best consumed or for freshest taste within 110 days. And the assumption is that in 110 days, that beer is going to be at 20 degrees Celsius, room temperature, this sort of temperature, and it'll last about 110 days. Okay? If you increase the temperature by 10 degrees Celsius, you're going to speed up aging by threefold. So at 30 degrees Celsius, which it doesn't get to very often in this country, you've got 1 month. And at 40 degrees Celsius, which it is in my garage in Davis, California, just over 100 Fahrenheit, in the middle of summer, it's easily that temperature. Then we've got a little bit more than a week. And at 50 degrees Celsius, Death Valley, drink it quickly. Okay? But if you're at 10 degrees Celsius, 3 times slower than at 20, 9 months. And at refrigerated temperature, around 4 degrees Celsius, way over a year. So the single biggest factor which is going to influence the flavor stability of beer and oxidation in beer is that temperature. This is why Sierra Nevada, for example, ship the beer in refrigerated containers and send it to a refrigerated warehouse. It keeps it fresh, okay, and buys you a huge amount of shelf life. There's nothing the maltster can do, or in the brew house you can do, that compares anything like that order of magnitudes of importance. Now, I was in a restaurant in Davis one time, and they only had 2 beers, Peroni and Budweiser. That's the only 2 beers they had in this restaurant. So when I ordered my beer, I said, "I'd like a nice young Budweiser, please." And it came, and it was about 7 months old. Why? Because they don't rotate the stock. So you empty the stuff from the front and you shove it in from the front, and the stuff's lingering at the back. People talk about freshness, they talk about blaming the maltster, and they don't even handle how they rotate the stock. I mean, come on, give me a break. Third factor is sulfur dioxide, metabisulfite. Okay? And that's because many of the substances which make beer go stale contain what I'm supposed to pronounce in America the carbonyl group. You might know it as the carbonyl group. And the carbonyl group reacts with sulfur dioxide. So if you take stale beer and add enough sulfur dioxide to it, metabisulfite, you'll get rid of the stale flavor. It binds it. Now, SO2, therefore, is tremendous as a binding agent for suppressing staling. Yeah, it's got some other antioxidant abilities as well, but the main benefit of it is it will bind these staling substances. So there's a lot to be said for metabisulfite sulfur dioxide. Now, if you go much beyond 25, 30 milligrams per litre, then you get a burnt match flavour. The problem in the United States is you've got to label it. I don't know what the situation is over here, but in the US, if you've got more than 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams per litre, you've got to put the words contains sulfite on the label. Now, I will defy you to find any beer in the USA which has got the words contains sulfite on the label. I also defy you to find a wine that doesn't have the words contains sulfite on the label. So we do have the moral high ground. But it will buy shelf life. It will buy shelf life if you're prepared to do it. Now, when people talk about carbonyl substances, they always talk about something that used to be called trans-2-noninal. These days it's called E2-noninal. And the chemistry is quite obvious. Noninal, 9 carbon atoms. Ene, it's got double bond. Al, it's got a carbonyl group. E2-noninal. And if you buy a bottle of E2-noninal and you open it, it smells of cardboard. I can give you beers that smell of cardboard that don't have any detectable levels of E2-noninal in them. I can give you beers that have got E2-noninal in them and they don't have any detectable cardboard character. So there's more to life than E2-noninal. There's a bunch of carbonyl substances which contribute to staling, not just that material. So where does it come from? Where do these carbonyl substances come from? The first thing is bitter substances. Told you earlier on, Charles Dalgleish showed the bitterness level goes down. When the bitter substances break down, they make carbonyl compounds. Well, that's damned inconvenient. You can't go running to your company and say, I've been listening to that amazing Charlie Bamforth, and he says bitterness causes staling, so let's take the bitterness out of the beer. You can't do it, okay? And people don't like that, so they ignore it. Alcohols break down to give carbonyl substances. That's damned inconvenient, isn't it? Because how can you have a beer that doesn't have alcohols in it? Amino acids break down to give carbonyl substances. How unfortunate. I can't conceive of making a beer without amino acids. But unsaturated fatty acids, who the hell wants them anyway? And they break down to give E2-noninal. That must be it. So what do you have? Everybody studies, everybody writes papers about the oxidation of unsaturated fatty acids. This, if you sort that out, you'll sort out staling. And all I can say to that is, and pardon my French, I haven't got any better since I went to live in California, bullshit. That is absolute nonsense. But everybody focuses on it, as if that is the answer to sorting out staling, and it just isn't. Will it help? Well, it can't do any harm, but it is not the solution. So people therefore talk about something called lipoxygenase. And this enzyme, there used to be a guy called Joop van Weisberg. And Joop van Weisberg used to go all over the world frightening people to within an inch of their life about the dangers of lipoxygenase. I was in a meeting in Miller Brewing Company once, and this lecture went on for 5 hours. And the audience took it in shifts, much like these guys are doing now. They took it in shifts, and people would come in and replace somebody else who was there. You know, it's tag listening. And, he just talked about lipoxygenase. And he accused me once of a full frontal assault on his integrity, which was true, because I said you don't need lipoxygenase to oxidize an unsaturated fatty acid, because you can do it with oxygen and metal ions. So there's this big obsession with lipoxygenase. So much so now that there is available barley which does not produce lipoxygenase. And this is being touted as one of the big hopes for improving flavor stability. So let me take this opportunity to tell you about how experiments are done on flavor stability. Okay? And the first thing to tell you is how people measure flavor stability. Some people measure it by something called nominal potential. Well, that can't be enough because it's only one of the potential materials. I'm not sure I can do anything about that, but anyway. But ultimately, it's got to come down to taste, okay? So what do people do? They take a beer, you produce a beer, and you force age it, because otherwise experiments will take a very long time. So you force age it. And the classic force aging regimes for the packaged beer are 30 degrees Celsius for 4 weeks or 60 degrees Celsius for 1 day. And that, if you think about it, relates to this threefold factor. So if something goes 3 times faster at 30 than 20, that's why you have a month at 30. And if you work it through to 60 degrees Celsius, it's 1 day. Now, if you taste a beer that's been aged at 60 degrees Celsius for 1 day, it doesn't taste like a beer that's been aged at 30 degrees Celsius for a month. And that doesn't taste like a beer that's been aged at 20 degrees Celsius for 3 months. But it's a yardstick, and I understand why people do it, including myself. Okay? What you get at the higher temperatures, guess what? Much more cardboard. So one of the reasons there's this emphasis on cardboard is because of the nature of this aging regime. So what people do is they take the beer, they cook it in an oven, and then they taste it. And you look at the papers, they very seldom tell you how many people tasted it. And how many times did they do the experiment? Okay? And what is the reproducibility of this? Okay? And what they do is they usually score this on a scale of 0, which is really beautifully fresh, to 5, which is stale as hell. So 1 is, it's detectably stale, and 4 is pretty unpleasant, and 3 is stale, and 2 is, well, that's getting on there. And they do a control, and the control might be 4.1, 4.1, and the trial may be 3.4. Well, 3.4 is a lower number, therefore fresher than 4.1. We have a result. Still bloody stale, okay, but it's better. So think about it. Now, I'm not picking on the people who make lipoxygenate-free malt. Well, I am, but lots of other people do this as well. So how do you do the experiment? Okay, so you've got a regular barley, and you've got your lipoxygenate-free barley. The first thing you're going to do is steep them, germinate them, kiln them. And of course, nothing else is going to differ. The only thing that's going to be different between those two is one has got lipoxygenase and one is not developing lipoxygenase. No, nothing else could possibly differ. Then you're going to precisely the same for both of these malts. By the way, this is irony, okay? And then you're going to boil them identically, and then you're going to go through the whirlpool. You get the drift all the way down. Then you're going to package those beers identically. Then you're going to stick them in an oven at 30 degrees Celsius for a month. You're going to taste them. One's going to be 4.1, that's the control, and the trial is going to be 3.4. Oh, we have a success. Let's sell it. They don't tell you how many times they did the experiment. Was it 1 control and 1 trial? Was it 10? So did those 10 controls and those 10 trials all give you this consistent, and it was 3.4 plus or minus 0.002 and 4.1 plus, they don't tell you. And it's still stale. Because sorting out lipoxygenase is not sorting out the oxidation of isoalpha acids, higher alcohols, amino acids, loss of hop character, blah, 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 blah. So people saying, oh, maltsters give us a stale character. I can't agree. I cannot agree with you. And I won't agree with you. This is not something to blame the maltster on. Loving creatures, people who fondle grain, weeping with joy at the cucumber aroma and the malt taste and so on and so forth. Beautiful, beautiful people. Let's not, God, I sound like bloody Donald Trump then. But anyway, you get the drift. It's complicated. So what is stability? Think about it. Think about, if you do experiments, those of you who don't believe in having chicken soup, and those of you who do believe in having a long shelf life before the beer goes cloudy, how do you measure, how do you predict haze stability? One of the classic ways is hot-cold cycling. And what you measure is the development of haze. And you don't measure how hazy, you measure how long did it take to get hazy. Because stability is all about time. It's all about time. It's not about intensity. It's not unimportant. Intensity is important. But how long? How long does it last before you go, ah, I see a difference? That's what you should be measuring, and that's what you should be judging in terms of the shelf life of product, not the intensity of staling. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave some time for questions. It's a tremendously complicated topic. But when people say, well, we need to minimize oxygen uptake in the brewery, I say, well, I get it, and there are good reasons why you want to minimize oxygen uptake in a brew house. Okay? So what happens to oxygen in a brew house? Well, the first thing that happens is it reacts with something called gel proteins. There was a guy from Heineken many years ago called Mutz, and he did a lot of work on gel proteins. And gel proteins have got a lot of thiol groups, a lot of sulfur groups in them. And if you oxidize them, they cross-link, and they give you stickiness. They give you like a gel. So if you look at the top of a mash, you often see something called Teig or Überteig, top dough. And that, one of the major contributors is these gel proteins due to oxidation. And the stickiness, it slows down the rate of liquid flow. So one of the consequences of oxygen uptake in a mash is reduced rates of lautering. Okay? The second thing that happens is when you react those proteins together, the oxygen is converted into hydrogen peroxide. Now, Robert Muller at BRF many years ago, he did a lot of work in this area. And the hydrogen peroxide reacts with polyphenols. Okay? Now it can be non-enzymic and it can be enzymic. Okay? Either way, the first thing that happens when you oxidize a polyphenol is it changes color. So if you slice an apple in half, it turns brown in due course, and that's because of the oxidation of polyphenols. That can happen in a mash. Now if you're making Guinness, who gives a rat's ass? But if you're making Coors Light, it can be a very significant source of color pickup. So if you want to know why the North American larger brewing companies are obsessed with oxygen uptake, it's because of color development. That's the main reason. When you oxidize the polyphenol, it polymerizes, and what it does is it sticks together with proteins. So the third consequence of oxidation in a mash is you get increased turbidity. Okay? And the levels of polyphenol and the levels of haze-forming proteins that go into the wort are reduced. So the haze potential, the lower the oxygen level in the mash, the greater is the turbidity potential in the wort, and thus in the beer. Some of you remember a guy called Dennis Briggs. Dennis did a lot of work on putting hydrogen peroxide into mashes. I don't advocate it. But it improved the haze stability of the beer. So when brewhouse manufacturers started making low oxygen uptake brewhouses, that coincided with people having more problems with turbidity and haze in beer. Okay? So I'm quite confident and quite certain that oxygen uptake in a mash can have a material influence on the physical stability of beer. I think the jury is out on flavor stability. Because you see, lipoxygenase is only one of the ways in which oxygen can be used in the brew. And the thing about lipoxygenase is it's not very heat stable. Now, if you're mashing in at a low temperature, that's not good news when it comes to lipoxygenase. But if you're mashing in at 65 Celsius, something like that, that lipoxygenase is destroyed pretty damn quickly. Now, we've done a lot of work on all sorts of other enzymes that will consume oxygen in a mash. Some of you may have read them if you open the pages of the JIB. Oxalate oxidase. Never heard of that, have you? There's an enzyme called oxalic acid oxidase, which takes oxalic acid and consumes oxygen. The one I'm most excited about is ascorbic acid oxidase, which nobody reported before. Okay? And if you put ascorbic acid into beer, it has not the blindest bit of influence. But if you put ascorbic acid into a mash, that ascorbic acid is used by ascorbic acid oxidase to mop up oxygen. So guess what? If you have ascorbic acid in the mash, you increase the level of polyphenols going through into the brew, you increase the level of the sulfur substances which go through, and you affect the clarity as well, because you're minimizing oxidation of other things. So I think there's a lot of scope in the future for doing trials on ascorbic acid. Don't do it yet. We're still working on it, okay? So don't try it too quickly, but keep an eye on this exciting development, okay? Okay? So oxygen can go into different places in a mash. So there are some people, and they would live in an anaerobic brew house. They'd go in like Jacques Cousteau in the morning with an oxygen tank strapped to their back, and they'd go in to minimize the absolute level of oxygen in a mash. You can do simple, sensible things, okay? Every time you splash something into a vessel, you're picking up air. If you've got pumps that continue running when, the liquid, you're picking up air. If you're pushing liquids around using air as a motor gas, you've got a problem. Okay. Obvious things. Mark will remember a lovely guy who worked with us called Preston Besford. And Preston Besford said to me one day, "I say, old boy," because that's how he talked as well. "I say, old boy." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'd like some redox probes." I said, "Redox probes measuring the relative amount of oxidation reduction." "Would you?" "Yes." I said, "But you've got two already." "Have I?" I said, "Yes." "Where are they?" I said, "There's one here, and there's another one just like it on the other side. You can see where the air is being whipped in." That was the least of the problems at Preston Brook. But anyway. But the other point I make is this, and I will throw open to your questions soon. If you oxidize the wood, pretty soon it's going to encounter yeast. And yeast loves carbonyl compounds. Think about it. Acetaldehyde converts it into alcohol, thank God. Diacetyl, as I'm used to saying these days. Diacetyl, it's got two carbonyl groups. What does yeast do? Gets rid of them. Same with pentanedione. So if you've got carbonyl substances upstream, the yeast is going to clean them up. Here's another thing you can try. Take a stale beer and treat it with good, vigorous, young yeast. It'll clean it up. That's why bottle-conditioned beer has got a lot going for it. Because the yeast is not only mopping up oxygen, it's mopping up the carbonyls as well. Long live Worthington White Shield. Happy days when I was research manager in Bath, and in the corner of the lab was our crate of Worthington White Shield. These days you can't even have water in the laboratory. We had Worthington White Shield. 10 o'clock every morning, Roy Parsons, some of you remember Roy Parsons, would come along and have his first White Shield. Roy has an interesting character. He looked like a sort of down-market Roy Orbison, if you remember. He was also a sex therapist. So literally he was, and he would field questions from interesting clients. They always seemed to be female in the laboratory. But at 10 o'clock every morning, he would go and get his first, Jill, you're looking as though you're complexed by this, but he would come and get his first white shield of the day and get his glass, turn it away so that the label, the correct label on the glass could be seen. The bottle, turn that so that the label was facing the customer, so everybody could see how good was your selection. Then he'd pour it very gently, and when the yeast started to appear from the bottle, he would stop. Drink the yeast, which was his B vitamins, have his first sip of beer, and then he would get his Daily Telegraph and go down to the gents, stay there for 10 minutes, come back, and do DMS measurements all day, sipping White Shield after White Shield. He's dead now, but that's got nothing to do with the White Shield. But White Shield, very, very fresh. Ladies and gentlemen, oxygen is a complicated topic. Flavor stability is a complicated topic, but it really is quite simple. Keep out the oxygen, keep it cold, and drink it young. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, George. Questions? Complaints? Disagreements? Yes, sir.
Sorry, can I just pass you that, please? Thank you. We're seeing a lot of chicken soup beers in can, which presumably is going to improve their stability because the oxygen is being scavenged, the can is contributing nothing.
Well, it depends if it's the yeast
any
or
comment?
not. Well, it depends what the turbidity, what the chicken soup is due to. And that's a movable feast. You see, one of the things I talk about with haze, I say, you know, one of the sources of haze is starch. And if you get starch in your beer, you're a blithering idiot. And what are people doing? Deliberately adding starch to the beer to try to control a fixed level of turbidity. You know, people say, come on, what's the name of that pub that's near IBD? Dean Swift. So we did this session in the Dean Swift, and I said, you know, there's a lot to be said for malt, hops, yeast, and water, and talking about hazy beer. And this guy said I was a Luddite, but that's okay. And what I say to people is, if people buy these beers and they enjoy them and drink them, okay, I do not have any right to say that's wrong. Okay? But it's when they make claims about them that really upsets me. Now, if that turbidity is due to lupulin glands, I get it. Okay? I get it. But if it's due to starch, and if it's due to yeast, I don't get it. Now, I understand tradition, I get Hefeweizen, I understand all those things. But if people can prove to me that given beer is, through blind tasting, is better, turbid as opposed to bright, I'll buy into it. But if it's just down to a visual thing, I won't. Now, what I often refer to at this point is a beer that we used to have in the Bass stable, one of my personal favorites called Stones, which you'll remember, Stones Bitter from Sheffield. And we put it in cans, but we had two large pack versions. We had the cask and the keg. Now, the keg, of course, was higher in carbonation, filtered and stabilized, and served a little bit colder, I think, from memory. The cask, of course, best described as an angel weeping on your tongue. Cask conditioned, just a beautiful, beautiful drink. And I like them both, but to my mind, the Stones on cask condition was vastly superior to the other one. And I've always put it down to carbonation. I've always put it down to that. But I just wonder whether the filtration took anything away from it. You know, when people say, I read somewhere, somebody said, oh, you filter, you take away dextrins. Give me a break. Even if you did take away dextrins, which you won't, it's not going to influence the flavor. So again, I come back to the point that if people can legitimately prove that a beer that is cloudy compared to the equivalent beer that is bright is somehow better, I'll accept that. You've got to prove it. But it's a storyline. It's a storyline. It's yet another of these points of difference. Look at us. We do, you know, more and more alcohol. It's beer into squirrels. It's deer semen, whatever the latest gimmick is. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, unless you prove it otherwise, it's a gimmick. Having said that, there's some fairly prominent brewers now that are coming out with some overtly cloudy beers and marketing them on that basis. That was quite a long answer, I'm sorry. Any other? Yes, sir.
What would you then say about the differences in flavour between, say, a Hefeweizen and a Cristal?
Well, I haven't made that direct comparison for the same brand side by side. So again, if that experiment has been done and demonstrated.
I haven't done it as an experiment, but I mean, I have tasted the two. For example, there are plenty of brands in Germany that do a Cristal.
Right.
They are discernibly different.
Which is better than the other?
Oh, right, it's a matter of choice.
Yeah, yeah.
I've met people that prefer the Cristal. So.
If there is something in that operation which is taking something away or putting something in, yeah, I will buy it. But the real point I'm making is that these things are being pushed on a basis of they're clearly, not clearly, that's a bad term, they're obviously better because they're less processed. So it's a storyline. And that's the real point that I've got issues with. It's the storyline. And I use Facebook. I'm too old, I know, but I do. And recently I put two pictures up there. One was clearly a bright North American lager beer, and one was a hazy beer. And I said, look, I just want you to say left or right. Don't say anything else. Well, people couldn't resist it, could they? They had to comment, you know, this horse is not fit for work, blah, 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 blah. But there was a 2-to-1 preference for the bright beer. But people were saying that's industrial beer, the bright one. It's industrial beer. In other words, it's one of the big companies. And the other one is craft and carefully brewed and so on. Storyline, you know, that's what it's all about. It just drives me nuts. From a country where a craft brewer is less than 6 million barrels of beer per annum, you know, which is equivalent to the output of Denmark. Yes, John? Oh.
Thanks very much. Something that triggered me here was a few years ago I went to the Czech Republic and I visited a brewery there, and I think we can call it the original. And you know what the second part of the word would be. And all their brewing is traditional, which means basically they have a lauter grant. There's a lot of splashing. I've seen it myself. And yet they say they've never had any problems with flavor stability because their philosophy is basically, it's like with little children. You have to stress them when they're young. So in brewhouse, don't basically spare them any kind of rigors of life. Just expose them to oxygen. Everything will be fine afterwards. A little bit simplistic, but the product quality that I've observed with that particular brand in bottle as well has convinced me maybe there's something in it. Over to you.
Yes, but also that same beer is well known for a diacetyl character as well, which personally I prefer Tomcat P. Yes, the point is well made. But the point is with that beer, and in a country where they drink more per capita than any other country in the world, that's what people want. And if they want a slight diacetyl character, that is what they're expecting. And so be it. Catherine Smart was forever bringing me a glass of it, and I would forever say, no, thank you. Peroni, please. But, you know, it's horses for courses. But the important thing is consistency and achieving the same thing every time. Any more? Yes. Yes, you.
I've done trials in the past with a ascorbic acid in can and noticed a distinct difference in colour between the non-ascorbic acid and the ascorbic acid dose cans. What would be your sort of explanation for that? Because you did state before that it didn't have a difference, or it didn't make a difference.
When I said it didn't make a difference, I was really referring to flavour stability. So ascorbic acid, what you would get more colour in the non-ascorbic acid?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, it is clearly, it is acting to prevent that from happening. But in terms of staling, you know, we've looked at it, I tell you, we can't find any benefit downstream. But the ascorbic acid upstream, and we can explain it because there's an enzyme there which is using it to mop up oxygen. Any more? All right, well, thank you. And there's one thing I have to do, which I'm delighted to do, in my role as immediate past president of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. I think my beautiful assistant here is going to help me with this. But we have a successful diploma candidate, who is in the audience, and I would like to present this certificate and this fine trophy to them. So, Mick Stavniski, please, would you... Thank you.
So a huge thank you to St Austell for hosting us, for the team for doing all the streaming up to IBD. I hope that's worked. Thank you to John as well for your time. Thank you all very much. Let's have a beer.